Hi everybody. We're going to go ahead and move on to one of our last topics here in the semester, and that is to talk about the role of education and school for teenagers. And this is an important issue in the study of adolescence because it takes up substantial time and energy in the lives of most adolescents. You know, the typical American high school contains all kinds of students, and teachers struggle to keep them engaged in learning. So if you think about it, and especially for those of you who are education majors, you are competing with an awful lot when you're teaching your students. They're thinking about stuff going on at home with their friends. Maybe they were out late at a part-time job and are tired, and you're trying to teach them math or science. So really, you're competing for an adolescent's attention with a whole lot of other things. The success of high schools in the United States is mixed. Most adolescents in the United States do graduate from high school, and then another percentage go on and get their GEDs. Many go on to college, but yet our evaluations say our academic achievement is really below what it should be. So in this chapter, we're going to talk about a couple different things. We're going to talk about how the schooling of adolescents has changed over the years. We'll talk about academic achievement and what works and what doesn't work, and then some of the problems that we have with schools. So let's start off by looking at some of the changes in the educational system just in history. Before I do, something I want you to kind of keep in mind as we go through this talk is to think about how you believe your high school prepared you or did not prepare you for college. This is always a topic I like to discuss in class with students, and oftentimes the kinds of things I hear are things like, they didn't emphasize writing, or they never really taught me how to study. So take just a minute and think about whether you felt like your high school experience prepared you for college and why or why not. Okay, so changes in the schooling of adolescents. Compulsory education laws in the early 1900s really went far to increase the number of adolescents attending school, because prior to that, kids didn't have to go to school, and many of them didn't. They were needed to work on the family farms or in factories once those started coming up. But not only has the proportion of adolescents in school changed, but the kinds of things they learn has changed also. So if we look back at the 19th and 20th century, only the wealthy kids went to school. So high school was mainly for wealthy kids in the United States. And they received a pretty broad liberal arts education, not unlike the kinds of subjects that you're taking in college. So they were exposed to history and art and literature and music. Nothing really job related though, because it was assumed that those kids probably didn't have to really work. They were probably going to inherit their parents' money, and the objective was not practical training for employment, but really more cultivation of the mind. So after the 1920s, more middle-class students started attending school, and the content of the education had to be changed to adapt to something more practical and focus on work training. And this was largely due to immigration and the increasing immigration class. So at this time, there began in the educational system a framework that still exists today, and that is comprehensive education. Comprehensive education emphasizes a general education, so those would be like the general gen ed requirements you have to take care of at Muskingum, college preparatory courses, and then also vocational training, so more specific, woodworking and carpentry, metalworking, things like that, more practical kinds of things. And let's see, in the mid-1900s here, things started changing to include more life skill kinds of things. The curriculum enlarged to include preparation for family, life, and leisure. So classes like health and home ec were added. It's rare to see home ec kinds of classes today, how to write a check, how to prepare a meal. I think it's kind of assumed that parents and family are going to pick up the slack for that, but that really isn't always the case. So the focus was on combining preparation for work and also life enhancement to promote and prepare a more well-rounded kind of individual. When we look at the mid-1900s up to more of the present, we've got a variety of things that happened depending on the year. So in the 1950s and the 1960s, there became a concern about deficiencies in science, and this came very much from the Soviet launch of Sputnik, the satellite, which you probably have read about in history classes. And during this time, during the Cold War, the United States really feared Soviet superiority. This was before the breakup of the Soviet Union. So there was a big concern in the United States to reinforce rigorous science courses in order to beat those Russians. That was really kind of the mentality here. And then there was an emphasis on science in the 50s and the 60s. We had to get ahead. And then in the 1970s, there were alarms raised that all this high school education was too far removed from real life. So all these courses on science were great, but where were the more practical life experience kinds of courses? So the new watchword became relevant. The push was to develop more programs that involved less traditional classroom time and more learning of workplace skills. So yeah, it's great to learn about physics, but what if that's not a job that you want to acquire? So we need to have more relevant kinds of courses. In the 1980s, there was yet another alarm sounded that all this applied education had reduced the rigor. So they've kind of bounced back and forth between the 1950s and the 1980s in terms of we want more rigor. Okay, now we have too much. Now we don't have enough. A lot of this came because the United States was found to rank pretty low in educational achievement in the world in the 1980s. And the United States students were seen as having just too much freedom to choose classes, and they were just choosing too many fluffy courses that weren't going to really apply to the workplace. And so there was a call for back to basics of math and science. So the educational system changed again. And this is really where it lies right now. Back to science, math, English, if they were American students, obviously. So that's really where we are now. It's really interesting to compare our educational system to that of the European system. I don't know if any of you have spent any time over in some of the European countries. But the United States is really very unusual for having only one source of secondary education. Generally in the United States, everybody goes to a high school. And some kids do spend some time in vocational school, maybe their junior and senior year. But for the most part, everybody gets the same kind of educational experience. But most European students actually have 3 different types of secondary schools to choose from. About 40% go to a college preparatory high school, which is very similar to our high school system. About 33%, about a third, will go to some kind of vocational school where they will learn a skill. They'll learn a trade, mechanics, or cosmetology, something like that. And then about 25% will go to a business trade school where they'll learn things like accounting or economics. The one big consequence of this is that kids have to decide pretty early on what educational track they're going to go through, about 15 or 16. And once they get into this track, switches are pretty uncommon. And you all know, I mean, think about yourselves, how many of you have probably switched your ideas of what you want to do as a career just since coming to Muskingum, let alone try to decide that when you're in high school. So U.S. high schools allow for more flexibility. Everybody gets the same training and then you can kind of do what you want. But it also is a one-size-fits-all kind of environment. So it's hard for teachers to appeal to all students. It's frustrating for teens who are sitting through these courses, algebra courses or whatnot, that, if they want to go into cosmetology, for example, they would prefer obtaining job skills. So really, Europe has a lot to teach us, I think. There's probably a happy medium that the United States could fall through. And I think they've tried to do that to some extent with the vocational training, but vocational training is also not nearly as widespread as it could be. And right now, there's so much emphasis on college prep and the idea that everybody needs to go to college and everybody should go to college. College is not meant for everybody. Not everybody needs a college degree to do what they want. And a lot of times the people who struggle the most in college are those who really aren't interested, don't want to use that. So I think as a society, we really need to get away from that model of absolutely everybody has to go to college. Not that I'm devaluing it, because of course I think it's important, but it's not for everybody. Okay, let's take a look next at schools, school quality, and what some of the qualities of effective schools, really good schools, are. So as we're going through this, think a moment about your high school and some of the things that you thought were good about it and some of the things that you thought could have changed. The first thing that we'll look at is school size. This is always an interesting discussion to do in the class. I would ask you all who went to a big high school, who went to a small high school, and usually you judge that by class size. So probably in our class there would be some of you that graduated with hundreds of kids, maybe 500, 600 in your graduating class. Some of you 100 or so, excuse me. And then there may be a few of you who had like 12 or 15 or 30 in your graduating class. So there's just such enormous variety out there. So let's talk about that. What is the optimal size for school and for classes? Well, one thing about it, larger schools offer some benefits. They can offer more diverse classes. So if you have to take an English class and you go to a big school, then you may be able to choose from medieval literature to 19th century literature or 20th century poets, versus in a small school, there's just going to be like a sophomore level English literature course. Larger schools have more extracurriculars that they offer, so there's a wide variety of athletics and co-curricular kinds of activities. But the interesting thing is that in smaller schools, students are more likely to participate in those activities and also to be in leadership positions. Because if you think about it, in a small school, if most kids don't participate, you're not going to have a band, or you're not going to have a FFA club, for instance. There is less diffusion of responsibility. So diffusion of responsibility is when you just assume other people are going to do things. You can't do that in a small school, or else you just won't have the organization. So the optimal size for high schools has been found through research to be anywhere from between 500 to 1,000 students total. That's not per class, that's total. But there isn't really a clear relationship between academic achievement and school size. So we're not saying that kids from bigger schools or smaller schools do better academically, but it is related to other things. It's really related to some extent to class size. So let's take a look at that. They find through the research that class sizes under 15, students usually do better. And that's, of course, because the teacher gets to know them, knows everybody's name, knows how everyone is doing. There isn't really a difference in between 20 and 40. So between 20 and 40, that's often the average class size, and there isn't really a difference in how kids do. But over 40, there is a difference. And I think that would be unusual to find a high school class of over 40 kids, but those kids tend to not do as well. So even though school size doesn't necessarily affect academics, school size does affect something called school climate, which has a huge impact. So let's talk about that for a minute. School size mostly affects the kinds of interactions between students and teachers. School climate has to do with the kinds of interactions that faculty and staff have with the students. So the warmth that's displayed. Are teachers interested in the students? Do they have high expectations and standards? So what is the quality of the teacher-student interactions? And we know that students do better off in schools where the teachers are supportive and involved, yet have high standards with firm discipline when needed. So that sounds an awful lot like authoritative parenting. So let me say that again. The teachers are supportive and involved, so they're warm and caring, but they have high standards and will discipline when needed. And we know very much that these qualities, much like authoritative parenting, impacts these three things about education. It impacts attendance, so kids are more likely to attend class and have regular attendance when there's a warmer climate. It definitely affects achievement, and part of this is because teachers care and keep up with kids, and then it also seems to affect delinquency rates. So school climate is a really important part of achievement and attendance. So since we're talking about teachers here, let's talk about them a little bit more. I would like for you to think about the kinds of teachers that you had in high school, and certainly you can think about college as well, but since we're talking about high school, so in terms of dealing with adolescents, what do you think are some qualities of good teachers? And then also, what did the teachers that you had that were not very good, what did they do? What made them not so good. So take just a minute, and if you're taking notes here, just scribble down a couple of things that you remember and things you think. Well, let me tell you what the research says. Okay, here are some examples of what the research says as far as what are good qualities of effective teachers, and probably most of these will not be a surprise to you. Good teachers are organized. They are enthusiastic about their subject matter. So even if a teacher is teaching something that students aren't necessarily interested in, their enthusiasm can go a long way. These teachers have high expectations for students. They show warmth, flexibility, being aware of individual differences. Let's see, high expectations I mentioned. Here's a couple other things. They also understand the development of adolescence, which is why if you are an education major, you're required to take classes in just developmental education. They also evoke a sense of trust from students, and they also trust their students. And then I added this in here on my own. I think that the best teachers for teenagers remember their own adolescence. They remember what it's like to struggle with so many things and go through all the developmental phases, and I think they just have a lot more empathy and understanding of that. Erik Erikson said that good teachers promote industry versus inferiority. So they allow students to feel like they can accomplish goals and do things versus feel like they can't do things. Here's a video clip that I will link down in the description of this video that is really good. It's a video of British, they just happen to be British, this video, kids, describing what they think the best teachers are like. And their answers are remarkably similar, but it's just interesting to hear their perspective. Okay, well, let's move on a little bit and talk about a topic called academic engagement, which is something that schools talk about an awful lot. It impacts achievement, it impacts attendance, it pretty much impacts everything. So engagement is when students are committed to learning. It's being committed, being psychologically committed to learning. That includes being alert, being attentive, making an effort, not just scraping by. So unfortunately, studies have found that engagement seems to not be the norm in U.S. high schools. So students are often physically present, but they're psychologically absent. And we've really already talked a little bit about some of the reasons why engagement is not the norm. School is competing with students' attention. Maybe they've got a part-time job, there's trouble at home, there's money issues, maybe there is psychological difficulties in the student. Regardless, there was a big study that was done a few years ago that gives us some examples of how unengaged many students are. This study surveyed 20,000 students. And here are some examples. 1/3 of students report that they rarely try hard in school. Another third report that they rarely pay attention in class. 2/3 report that they have cheated on a test in the last year. And then 90% report that they have copied another kid's homework in the last year. Now, obviously, these are good kids. A lot of them are good kids. A lot of them, the kids are really struggling, but it just really seems to be the norm is the message here. So a big portion of American teenagers are disengaged from school with the commitment to graduating with the least effort possible. And the author of this study also sees the main problems with engagement and achievement as lying beyond the classroom. So, hold on. Okay, there's nowhere I can go in my house and do this and get away from my dogs when they decide to bark. So I just have to try and shut doors and move them around. Okay, so let's move on and talk about some of the sources of disengagement that we see in teenagers. Maybe you can get this to click. There we go. Okay, so the first one that we'll look at is family environment. How do parents influence kids' attitudes and performance in school? That's the thing to think about. So off the top of your head, you could think of some reasons, you know, do they ask about school assignments? Do they attend school events? That sort of thing. So there's a few ways. First of all, in their expectations for achievement, we know that the higher a parent's expectations for achievement, their kids will tend to rise for it. So parents with high expectations have higher achieving kids in general. parents with lower expectations have lower achieving kids in general. Now, we also know that when a parent's expectations are high, that's going to influence other behaviors. They're more likely to be involved in their teens' education. So they're going to help the kids pick classes, they're going to go to school events, teacher conferences, they're going to keep track of grades, which obviously, since everything's online now, that's very easy to do. These parents are usually authoritative, so they're trying to promote self-reliance in the kid and persistence and responsibility. Now, what about indifferent parents? And we've talked about these different kinds of parents. Indifferent parents oftentimes don't know how their kids are doing. So these parents have a lower estimation of their kids' abilities. They think they don't necessarily do as well, lower engagement, and lower grades. So these are also qualities of the kids too. If parents don't think the kids can do well, then the kids certainly aren't going to think that. And if the parents don't seem to care, there's probably no reason for the kids to care. And if they're not checking up on their grades, it just may be easy to slide. So we see that authoritative type parents tend to be the best for school achievement. Indifferent parents have difficulties. When we look at the two differences, and thinking about your own education and those of your friends, you might think, yeah, there's more authoritative or more different. We find a fair amount of indifferent parents on the part of the kids. So this same study, this big study of 20,000 kids that Steinberg did, a third of the kids reported that their parents did not know how they were doing in school. Now, again, there's really no excuse for not knowing because all of this stuff is online now. A third of the kids, or half the kids, said that their parents wouldn't care if they got a C in a class, and almost half of the kids report that their parents never attended school programs. Now, there's lots of reasons and lots of variety here. Parents have work schedules. Some parents are working multiple jobs. I get it. But on the part of the perspective of the kid, they are seeing indifference, and then that affects their achievement as well. So here's a silly cartoon. This next one. Your son pays attention in class, but only to his iPod and cell phone. This is open school night. Welcome, parents. So sometimes that's the case too, unfortunately. Lots of schools obviously have taken to banning electronics in the classroom. Now, in addition to family environment, we know socioeconomic status also impacts engagement and achievement. There is a positive correlation between socioeconomic status and achievement. So the higher the family socioeconomic status, generally the higher the achievement of the class, the student. And the question is why. It's not the income level itself, it's the perhaps representation of other characteristics that lead to achievement. So for example, IQ is one. IQ tends to be related to some extent to socioeconomic status. Socioeconomic status is related to nutrition and health. So generally, kids, as socioeconomic status increases, those kids have better health care, better meals. There are fewer stresses as you go up in socioeconomic status. Income stresses, if the car is broken down and there's no money to fix it and can't get to class, all that stuff is a reality for a lot of kids. And then socioeconomic status is also related to parenting. Authoritative parenting is more related to increasing socioeconomic status, and authoritarian parenting is related to decreasing socioeconomic status. So, but again, remember there's so much variability in socioeconomic status and social class, and there are plenty of kids, lower socioeconomic status families whose parents are concerned and involved and have time to put in it, and these kids do just fine. Okay, two more variables here. A third variable is the influence of friends and peers on school achievement. Friends influence the amount of time that kids spend studying, how much effort they put into school, and the grades that they get. So kids are, as we've talked about, that consensual validation, kids are more likely to be friends with kids who have similar attitudes about school. They'll study together and encourage each other. But some research has found that low achieving adolescents who have friends that are higher achieving have grades that may increase over time. So if a kid is struggling in school but has friends that are doing better, they often will pull that kid up with them. They may help them study, they may encourage them in lots of different ways, so that can very much happen. But there are also instances where adolescents are concerned about having high achievement, fearing disapproval. I remember when I was in high school, I had a math teacher who would generally announce the high grade. She would hand out papers and say, so-and-so 100, so-and-so 95. I don't remember her calling out the low grades, but then those kids would get kind of picked on. I'm sure they train teachers not to do that kind of thing anymore, but this was back in the 80s. That was problematic. So the bottom line is kids are very much influenced by their friends and peers. Okay, the last variable that affects school achievement is work and leisure, and we're going to talk a little bit more about work in the next chapter, but the idea of part-time work can be good for adolescents in lots of ways, but it can also damage their school performance, especially when they work over 20 hours a week. So under 20 hours a week does not seem to be very detrimental to grades, but over 20 hours a week do, because they find that kids who work over that amount may take easier courses, they may be too tired to do homework, they may be too tired to pay attention in class, all those kinds of things. And they also know that socializing can take the place. Now, obviously, socializing is just the mainstay of many adolescents, but the average teen socializes 20 to 25 hours a week. Now, that statistic includes, it's probably higher because of the inclusion of online socializing, because some kids are constantly online with their friends. But time spent socializing is also associated with lower school grades, lower achievement, because, of course, it takes time away from studies. This is not to say that kids shouldn't socialize, but there need to be very much limits on pretty much everything. So just to wrap up this chapter, I want to tell you about a fairly recent study looking at engagement, because this is a big issue, trying to figure out how to get kids to we want to make sure the graduation rate stays high, how to keep kids interested in school. This was done by a researcher named Wang a few years ago. Did a longitudinal study of 1,500 teenagers in 7th, 9th, and 11th grade. So they followed them from 7th through 11th grade. What's 4-year longitudinal study. And they found that academic engagement decreased between 7th and 11th grade overall for kids, especially true for boys. Now, this isn't a huge study. 1,500 teens is sizable, but it's certainly not huge. They tried to make it representative, but this shows that high school, late middle school, and high school is the time when that engagement drops, and it might be for some of the things we've talked about. Kids aren't interested in taking algebra or history courses when they know they want to go into metalworking or something. But they also found in this study that the most important factor in engagement was the role of parents and teachers. So encouragement of parents, encouragement of teachers, having an authoritative kind of style went a long way in helping kids to stay engaged. So there certainly are things to do. There are lots of programs that schools are starting now to try and figure out kids who are at risk, keep them from dropping out, get them to finish and do well. And I'm sure those of you who are education majors have learned all about that. But we know a lot about the role of education and its impact on development.